GeoTrekkers, welcome to the GeoTrek podcast. We have a special episode today for anyone interested in international type of stuff, cross-cultural stuff, getting into landscape architect. Our guest is Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning at Utah State University. Benjamin George, thank you so much for coming on the GeoTrek podcast.
Thanks, Al, for having me on. Appreciate it.
I'm really excited. You called me up, I guess, a couple months ago. A lot of your students are traveling along the Gulf Coast over spring break, using their spring break to learn about planning and landscape architecture along the Gulf Coast region. I'm excited to meet them this week, and that kind of got us introduced, and we started some interesting conversations.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to them being able to meet you. And obviously your podcast listeners won't know, but originally I was hoping to be live with you there to experience your tour and stuff. So I'm sad I'm not going to be able to be on that trip with them and get to go on the tour, but I'm really excited for them to be able to do that. And I appreciate you making that possible and available to them.
I can't wait to meet them in person, and this is a great time of the year to come to the Gulf Coast. So maybe next spring break you could make it down this way. So Benjamin, I wanted to ask you, you're an associate professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning at Utah State University. So some of our listeners may be a little bit confused about the field of landscape architecture. Could you explain what that field is and what professionals in the field of landscape architecture do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the profession obviously has really deep roots going back to the dawn of civilization, similar to architecture, right? But you can point to like all the great gardens and the urban spaces, and I think most everybody would agree that's an example of landscape architecture. Things like Versailles and whatever. But the modern profession itself is thought to have started with Frederick Law Olmsted, who designed Central Park along with his collaborator Calvert Vaux. And so in 1863, actually, he used the term landscape architecture, or a landscape architect, I should say, as his professional moniker. And so that's kind of where you would point to and say this is the origin of the profession. It's tempting to just think of landscape architecture as gardens, and that's a common misconception.
Sure.
So funnily, we have a lot of students that have to explain to their parents, I'm not going to go to college to learn how to mow a lawn or something like that. But my wife, who was our academic advisor in the department for a long, long time, she would describe landscape architecture to people, potential students, their parents, et cetera, by saying, look at the space between the buildings. And all of that is what landscape architects do. And so that's everything from the traditional landscaping, and I'm doing air quotes there for your listeners, but the planted spaces, the landscaping, the circulation paths, whether it's pedestrian, bicyclist, vehicular, we touch the streetscapes, plazas, parks, zoos, theme parks, waterfronts, the planning of neighborhoods and towns, all the way up to planning at a regional scale, where we're covering across thousands of square miles. So we work at a lot of different sites, a lot of different scales. And that's one of the things that makes us pretty unique, puts us at the intersection of a lot of different fields. We have to know how to talk to and collaborate with a lot of different professions, architects, engineers, planners, biologists, ecologists, sociologists. It's a long list, gets pretty long. But that ability to be the middleman and to make sense of the interface between the built environment and the natural environment is, I think, what really makes us valuable in today's society. So that kind of in a nutshell is what we are.
Well, that's fantastic. And I'm thinking, your urban parks, your bike paths, your walking paths, your pedestrian areas, these things don't just happen, right? They have to be planned out and very intentional, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, they should be. You say they do happen. There's stuff that just happens, and you go back and you look at it and say, what were they thinking? And oftentimes it's that there was no thought that went into the planning of this or the design of this. And that's where, the case that we bring, we can, we say as a landscape architect, we're going to make your spaces, your community work better, function better, be more beautiful, and, serve the entire community.
No, that's fantastic. My undergrad degree was actually in geography, and one of the electives I took was in landscape architecture at Penn State University. Really one of the best classes I had, and it made me rethink how I see urban and suburban and just the built spaces. A lot of things that I just took for granted. I'm like, wait, that maybe had been planned or designed that way.
Yeah. And it's funny because a lot of people, they are not even aware of the profession of landscape architecture. I was not aware of it until I got married, and my wife, her dad was a developer. He is a developer. And so she was aware of landscape architects. She wanted to go into landscape architecture, and she was the one that introduced me to it. But it's funny because obviously, like I said, if you look at the space between the buildings, there's, who designs that? And but we never really, a lot of people, I think, don't ever give second thought about where do these spaces come from.
Yeah. No,
So
it provides context. I think that the backstory kind of, right? Like how this was
mhm.
planned, or the reason for maybe some of the designs we see on the landscape.
Yeah,
Benjamin,
absolutely.
I wanted to ask you, so, landscape architecture, environmental planning, it can help mitigate the impacts of extreme weather and natural disasters. Can you think of some examples where maybe planning the landscape actually helped to mitigate some of these extreme, whether it's an extreme weather event, natural
Yeah.
disaster, how does that play in?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great question. Kind of like talking broad scale. So we would work in two different ways to do that. The first would be prevention, and the second would be mitigation, right? So prevention, if we talk about that, we have some decent safeguards built into our city codes about where you should build. Probably one of the thing that most people would be familiar with would be floodplains. Okay, and so obviously we're involved in that design process of a site, and one of the things we're going to consider is like, where's the floodplain? Okay, let's not build a house,
Sure.
let's not build a store, etc., in a floodplain. Okay, now that's low hanging fruit, right, per se. But if we're going to try and dive a lot deeper, consider all the different factors and trying to make design determinations. And sometimes you need to go back to the client and say, hey, this is a bad idea, we shouldn't be building
Sure.
in this location, right? The proverbial, just because we can doesn't mean we should.
Yeah.
So or maybe we need to scale things back, and that's kind of more likely. It's pretty rare a project gets canceled because of
Okay.
natural disaster concerns, right? I mean, it's not like the state of Florida has said, let's stop building because of
Sure.
hurricanes.
Sure.
Okay. So but anyway, so most of what that means, because we're not really canceling projects because stuff is in a dangerous spot. It's that
Sure.
most of our work is going to fall into mitigation, right? How do we, this project's going to be built, or the site already exists, what can
Okay.
we do to mitigate for it? So a couple, let me give you one specific example that I think is a nice example exactly of what we could do, and then maybe just touch on a couple of different general, like, other areas. The first, but this example is is there, we're really involved in a lot of work with sea level rise and with the impacts of storms and their impact on coastal communities. Obviously, lots of the population lives at the coastal communities. Landscape architects do a ton of work in recreation, waterfronts, and all this happens at that edge. And so it's so we have a lot of we're very invested in how do we make these areas successful and preserve these areas. So one specific project was done by a couple landscape architects at Scape, which is
Okay.
firm, and then Stantec. These two firms on Staten Island, right, in New York. And what they did is they, after Hurricane Sandy came through, I can't remember what year that came through, but there's been a lot of really looking at, okay, how do we preserve or protect, mitigate this type of stuff in the future? And so they designed a living breakwater, I should say, and then also accompanying site shoreline project on the site. And so what they did was they designed and tested these varying heights of breakwaters to reduce the amount of waves and erosion that's going to be
Sure.
happening. And it's not preventing flooding. The breakwater itself isn't going to prevent flooding, but it minimizes erosion. It makes the shoreline more resilient. And what's really kind of cool is that they used these engineered concrete stones, which allowed them to then design them. And they designed them with little niches to provide habitat for sea life, right? So not only is it then this breakwater that's very functional, but it's also creating habitats and improving the ecological conditions there. So that was built. And like I said, it doesn't prevent flooding, it does prevent or helps to minimize erosion. So it makes
Sure.
the shoreline more resilient. But then it was accompanied by called the Tottenville Shoreline Protection Project, which was built. Basically, it's a series of artificial dunes that were created to keep flooding out, and any floodwaters that got past to like trap them in kind of pools to protect the coastal communities.
Yeah.
But it's designed as a park, right, with paths and open space, and so most people probably, they don't even realize it's a practical flood defense system.
Sure.
They only see it as this beautiful naturalized kind of coastal habitat that they go recreate in, and they don't recognize that it's actually helping to protect those communities there. So that's like one example, like specific example. Other things for us out in the West, I don't know if you consider this a natural disaster. I mean, it is, but drought is
Sure. Absolutely.
huge issue for us out here
Yeah.
right now. And so, we're very much involved in looking at how do we update and change the plant selection. I mean,
Sure.
for the West, most of us, you go to Home Depot and or a lot of garden centers even still, you're buying the same plants that you could potentially buy on the East Coast where you
Yeah.
get
Very
so much
interesting.
more water, right? And so looking at updating our plant selection, our what
Sure.
we're looking at, and then looking at like mimicking nature and how do we use, because we're surrounded by these beautiful landscapes that
Yeah.
millions of people flock to in the national parks,
Right.
and they require no extra water other than what Mother Nature gives it.
You're right. There's a
So how
natural
do we?
habitat that's
Yeah,
natural to the area, right? And it makes sense to kind of pay attention to what Mother Nature's doing
yeah.
already in the area, right?
Exactly. And so we're designing with nature and we're trying to recreate that, to create these landscapes. They're still beautiful. They're still lush. People still love it, but it uses way less water. Right.
Yeah.
So examples like that. We have similar practices with trying to prevent or mitigate for fire,
Sure.
and large fire events, looking at winds. Obviously we're not going to really mitigate that much for hurricane or tornado force winds or something, but we get really strong windstorms like say here. And so getting into, down to the what tree are you going to plant, but up to like broader planting, shelter belts, things
Yeah.
like that, managing storm water in communities from storm water events and stuff. So that's kind of some of the other broader areas as well, that
Yeah,
we're
that's
involved
interesting.
in.
Benjamin, I lived for a year in Broomfield, Colorado, between Denver and Boulder, and I thought it was interesting driving down we had a 2-lane road that had a median in the middle and then 2 lanes on the other side. And almost every day they'd have the sprinklers out. That whole thing was
Mhm.
just a carpet of grass. And I was thinking,
Yeah.
I don't know, they get 22 inches of rain a year or something. It's a semi-arid climate for sure. And it just made me wonder, I mean, in the case of the Intermountain West, getting out towards the West Coast, do you just have a lot of people with kind of an East Coast mentality that move out there that just think the median should have grass, my yard should have grass, as opposed to maybe rock gardens or some things that fit better with the climate in the semi-arid West?
Yeah, and I mean, you think about this. This is a cultural. There's cultural heritage and baggage, I guess that you could say, with this, because this, the colonial landscape was mimicking kind of old, jolly old England, and the Northeast was somewhat similar climate wise, and the South
Sure.
was obviously very lush as well. And so as we've marched across the country, we've kind of carried this with us. But it's really interesting. Compare that to say like California landscapes, which had the heritage of Spain
Sure.
and
Sure.
Spanish landscapes, right? Very, very different. Very much more conscious of what of water conservation and things like that. But you're right. There is still this legacy in much of the West of I got to have my grass, and
Yeah.
a beautiful yard is a green grass yard that is
Sure.
mowed twice a week, and we've we're fighting to change that. Here in Utah, we're looking at there's very dire projections for the future of the Great Salt Lake
Sure.
because all the water is being diverted to irrigation and stuff like that. And, you know, residential is a relatively small slice of the pie as far as the water usage goes. But at the same time, we're all kind of all in this together, right? So
yeah, and I could see landscape architects, I could see planners and landscape architects really at the forefront of all this, right? Because it is about the landscape, and it's about planning. And really, I know you get wetter years out there, but it's not that uncommon to have 2, 3, 4 years in a row of extremely dry conditions, right? Where your yard isn't going to make it.
Oh no, absolutely. And I mean, right now we are having one of the wettest, years on record. I was just up skiing yesterday, and the ski lift is like the lines are so much closer to the snow below me. I can just jump off at any point, right? But but before that, we had I'm trying to remember. I think it's maybe like 6 or 7 years since we've had a really good snow, or even an average kind of snow season. And the last couple of years, it feels kind of like the summer monsoons have failed. So it's something that we definitely have to be very cognizant of. And, projections are these types of droughts are going to get more severe and more frequent here in the West. And we need to be prepared. And it's not one of those things that you can just overnight change.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Your water sources, water uses, and like you said, a whole mentality of the culture, that takes a while to turn that ship, right?
Absolutely. It definitely does. It's a Herculean effort. So,
well, and Benjamin, it's going to be interesting for me to meet your students this week, because I'm in a very, very humid area. I mean, the Gulf Coast is really probably the most humid area in North America, you could argue. Very humid, a lot of precipitation. Your students are down here this week looking at flood protection and understanding the region. Could you tell me a little bit about this trip that they're taking, a little bit more about what they're learning, and kind of what the aim of this spring break week is for your students?
Yeah. Well, I think, for them, they're looking at it as we're going to eat a lot of beignets and crawfish, boy,
Oh yeah, the food is great.
Yeah, no, but the real reason so we do this, it's a requirement that students have to go on a travel trip, and the department puts together a bunch of different trips. And we take students to, the goal is to take them somewhere different, right?
Sure.
Than what they're experiencing here. So that they're able to go and see different cultures and communities and their approaches to design and, things like that. So primarily, what we want to have here looking at as they're coming here is to look at the Gulf Coast and to see the coastal communities and their history, and to start thinking about the future of those communities in an age of sea level rise and the impact that's going to have on these communities, and how do they adapt? How do they change? Can they adapt? Et cetera. So yeah, it's a very different landscape from the one that they're used to being in up here. But I think it's going to be a great experience for them.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think there's a huge value, I think, for students to get out and just experience a different region of the country, right? You're facing different hazards, different cultures. You get into South Louisiana, you have a lot of different flags have flown over this region, a lot of interesting history related with the French and the Spanish. And I think they'll be getting a lot out of this trip. So really cool that y'all chose the Gulf Coast for this week for them.
Yeah, and they're having a blast. So they're going to see you in a couple of days. It's going to be fun.
Yeah, it's going to be great. I think they'll find Galveston's like a little mini New Orleans in a sense. A lot of our architecture is from the mid to late 1800s. Obviously we had a massive hurricane. The deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history was September 8th, 1900 right here. So we'll be talking a lot about that with them. Just very different issues than you would find, I think, in the Intermountain West. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah. It should be fun. It should be
Benjamin, reading your biography, I couldn't help but notice you really have this love for the Iberian Peninsula, for Portugal, for looking at their history, at their landscapes. And, I'd ask you this question about how landscape architecture and environmental planning can help mitigate disasters. I wanted to ask you, the little bit I know about the Iberian Peninsula and disasters, something that really stands out seems to be this 1755 Lisbon, Portugal earthquake. I mean, it was a massive earthquake, huge tsunami for parts of Western Europe and North Africa. Could you tell us a little bit about that event and also just your interest in that part of the world and your perspective on it?
Sure, yeah. So let me just start by saying, my interest in it comes from my dad is Portuguese, immigrated from, he did not, but his grandparents immigrated from the Azore Islands out in the middle of the Atlantic, Portuguese islands. And so I've always had this, familial affinity, right, for Portugal. And that's kind of what draws me to it. And then
Sure.
it really helps that we live in this arid region. And like I was saying, I think there's a lot we can learn from how the Iberian Peninsula has developed and what cultures have done there to deal with their environment. So that's kind of
Sure.
the history of why I'm interested in it. So the 1755 earthquake. Do you want the long story, the long and interesting story, or the the cliff notes? So it was, a lot of your listeners might not be familiar with it. Okay. I'm a pretty big history buff. I wasn't aware of his existence until I read this book, The Day of Atonement by David Liss. It's a historical fiction. And I thought it was set against the backdrop of the earthquake. And I thought it was just a fictional, thing added, only discovered, nope, it was an actual event. It had incredible global impacts, both on society and design. It was a real game changer for Western civilization. It fundamentally changed, really, our relationship to religion and nature, and it led to innovations in the design of buildings and stuff. So to kind of set the stage, we need to understand the history of Portugal, or kind of the context of Portugal. So Portugal was a relatively poor backwater kingdom on the periphery of Europe, right? And if they wanted to trade with the rest of Europe, they either had to do it through Spain, which they had a pretty fraught relationship with over the years, or they had to utilize their sea routes. And so they preferred to do the later.
Okay.
And so that led to a lot of investment in naval capabilities. And so that led, to trade and, crucially kickstarting the age of exploration. And, during the 15th century and the 16th century, Portugal and Lisbon became phenomenally rich. They imported so much gold, they actually broke the gold market in Europe, basically.
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Because, they were absolutely just incredibly rich. And so they went from being like kind of the poorest of the poor to then the richest, most wealthiest, and really established the first kind of true, I would say, global trading empire. Everything.
And that turnaround would have been like 16th century, maybe 17th century.
Yeah, really, it really started in the 15th century when they started getting around the Gulf of Guinea down to kind of like modern Nigeria, that area there. And then really it was at the end of the 1490s. Columbus went to the Portuguese first and said, "Hey, I'm going to go sail sail west and get to China," right? And the Portuguese, though, they told him no. They didn't think it was possible, but they also had already heavily invested in trying to get around the Cape of Good Hope. And they succeeded in doing this basically at the same time that Columbus went over to America. They succeeded in getting around. And
so they went south, kind of around Africa.
They were going south. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yep. And they got to India, established like Goa. They put toeholds in the Middle East along the East African coast, all the way over into the Spice Islands, modern day, Indonesia and stuff, and became phenomenally rich, like just insanely rich off of this. And then, of course, just icing on the cake, they got Brazil, which was also, resources wise, phenomenally rich and stuff.
So they had all these resources like 15th, 16th, 17th century.
Yep. So expanding, became very, very rich. And so by the time 1755 rolls around, Lisbon has 250,000 people living there. It was the fifth largest city in Europe. It was famous for its wealth, obviously. The down at the heart on the waterfront, you had the Torrero do Passo, which is today the Praça do Comercio.
Okay.
And this was the waterfront along, the Tagus, the Tejo. This was where the royal palace was in Lisbon, or one of the Ribera Palace there. And it had probably the largest library in Europe, actually, at this time. And then another important civic palace, and I'm going to mention it just to kind of try and tie things together in the narrative here, was the Rocio, which was kind of like the main civic plaza. And this is where what was called the Auto de Fe happened. And this was basically, kind of think of the Portuguese version of the Spanish Inquisition. It was the Portuguese Inquisition. And it was a religious festival, so to speak, where victims of religious heresy were humiliated and punished, and many of them ended up being burned in this. And Lisbon was incredibly pious. So like over 10% of the population of Lisbon was in a religious order, right? Of some sort.
Interesting.
I mean, that's an insane percentage wise. And the country was actually in the middle of this kind of like anti-enlightenment phase as well, whereas like all the rest of the world had become, or all the rest of Europe was becoming more enlightened. It was, I'm trying to remember which queen, anyways, but the royalty basically was like, no, we can't have any of that enlightened thinking. We got to like, kind of go double down on
kind of like more religion and things like that.
And so Lisbon was known as this really pious city, like all throughout Europe. It's like, well, okay, hey, maybe we don't, even the English, we don't agree, because they're Catholic. This is after the Reformation, et cetera, and stuff. But it was still recognized as a very pious city. So insanely rich and insanely pious. Okay, so and that's important because 1755, the earthquake struck. It was November 1st, which is All Saints Day, right, in the liturgical calendar of the Catholic Church. And so all the churches were packed. And actually, this was kind of one of the first things, was that the bells had just stopped ringing for calling people to celebrate, right? And people described hearing the bells start resonating, and kind of like like if you have the wet brim of a glass, and you put your finger around it and you get the glass to resonate. So the bells started resonating. That was kind of like the first sign that the earthquake was about to happen. And so about 9:45 was when the first wave of the earthquake struck.
And this is in the morning.
This was in the morning, 9:45 in the morning, right? So the earthquake was estimated to have measured 9.0 on the Richter scale.
Wow, that's massive.
Absolutely massive. So one of the strongest, most violent earthquakes in recorded history. And I mean, we just had those tragic earthquakes in Turkey, right? Yeah. And I think those were 6.8 was the largest on that. And you got to remember as well that the Richter scale is logarithmic, right? So it's becoming, and you think about like the damage, obviously now we know, unfortunately, there was cutting corners in some of the building and construction in Turkey, but you think about a stone and brick city getting hit by 9.0 earthquake.
That's insane. And when you say logarithmic, so a magnitude 8 is 10 times stronger than a magnitude 7, which is 10 times stronger than a magnitude 6, right? So you really ramp up in those higher magnitudes, right? That sounds like incredibly violent. And like you said, just for a stone and brick city, I mean, the damage must have been astronomical.
Absolutely. And it wasn't, I mean, it was just the intensity itself. And people talked about it rolling like a ship. Right. On the sea for 2 minutes. So 2 minutes, the earthquake happened. People ran out of the churches. They ran out of like homes, etc. And people would be crushed by everything collapsing, whether it was inside or outside. And what became problematic for later on then was that because it was an old, it was an old city, you had all these serpentine kind of system of streets. And it just became this impassable jumble of debris. So anyways, it lasted for 2 minutes. Everybody, there was a minute break. I think it was a minute or 2 minute break. And then a second earthquake hit and that was 2.5 minutes. And then there was another little break. And then there was a third final major
Oh,
aftershock
wow.
that hit.
There's really
And
3 different earthquakes.
yeah. So it was 3. And so that one was 4 minutes. So you've got almost 9 minutes of shaking, absolute just devastating destruction, right, being visited here on the city.
Yeah.
And so the heart of urban Lisbon, the Baixa, was in complete ruins, and it had been
Wow.
built on it had been built on infill of where it
Sure.
used to be kind of an extension of the
Yeah.
river. And so anyways, that all got just absolutely destroyed. So down at the waterfront, the palace, though, was still largely intact. And there were a couple of other spots. If you ever have
Okay.
gone to Lisbon, and if you haven't, and all your listeners, if you have not gone to Lisbon, it is one of the most beautiful cities. But there is this neighborhood called Belém, and that it still has these really old monuments that were built because by just a fluke of geography, or sorry, not geography, of geology, Belém was basically left unscathed. But the rest was completely, pretty much completely devastated.
Yeah.
So you let the cat out of the bag about the tsunami there. But that came later. So, and of course, everything's in ruins. People are flooding. They're afraid. We've had these aftershocks. So,
Sure.
where do they go? They go to the large open spaces, and one of the largest then was the Torreiro do Passo down by the river. And so you have thousands of people who've made their ways down here. And then, of course, the water recedes out of the river, and then
Sure.
tsunami comes crashing in, and it just sweeps everybody away. It washed away the warehouses, right, where they had all these stores of gold and items and stuff like that, which would have been incredibly helpful after, post
Yeah. It just like
earthquake and
washed a
stuff.
lot of those away.
Completely gone. And in fact, there just like there were 3 earthquakes, there ended up being 3 tsunami surges.
Okay.
And by the end of it, they said you could walk across the entire river to the other side just on the debris
Wow.
that was left. But then, just to make it worse, right, because it was All Saints Day, everybody had started fires to come home from mass and to
Oh,
start,
yeah.
to have a meal. And
Sure.
so all these little fires, then, basically the rubble turned into this giant tinderbox.
Oh,
And
wow.
all these fires merged together into one, pretty much into one mega firestorm. And it became so intense, it created its own weather pattern, basically.
So it
And
was really earthquake, tsunami, fire. I mean, it's really like
absolutely, yeah.
3 hazards all triggered by the original seismic event.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And the fire got so hot, it melted glass. So hotter
Wow.
than 2,500 degrees, right? So it's estimated that at least 50,000 people died.
Wow.
Some estimates are up as high as 100,000 people, right?
That's amazing. And you said there were 250,000 living in the area to start with. So
Yeah,
that's even on the low end, that's 1 out of 5 people, but like it might have been
right.
higher than that, you're saying.
Yep, absolutely. And I mean, there's really no way, one of the challenges that historians and even, like the government, no way of really knowing, because so many people were washed out to sea with the tsunami, would have been burned beyond, any recognition. Or a lot of people were just like, that's it, I'm done. And they just left.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they just never came back. So that was kind of the event itself. And then you have the knockoff of like, okay, well, what did this cause
Sure.
in society and in design? And one of the things was that this was actually the earthquake sparked a really lively debate amongst philosophers. Voltaire commented on it, basically
Sure.
saying like, well, this wasn't an act of God, this was nature exerting its power and stuff. But Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he had some really interesting things where he was responding to Voltaire, saying, where Voltaire was saying, "Oh, this is all nature and stuff," and he said, "Well, wait, it wasn't." And I found this quote, and I wanted to share it because Rousseau wrote, "Admit, for example, that nature did not construct 20,000 houses of 6 to 7 stories there, and that if the inhabitants of that great city had been more equally spread out, more lightly lodged, the damage would have been much less." And I think that's pretty interesting, basically, for Rousseau to accuse and say, well, maybe this was so bad because of poor urban planning,
Like
right?
building in the vulnerable areas, perhaps, and such dense
Building, and
population.
yeah, so okay, like sure, people are going to be there, but Rousseau is essentially saying, what we now ask ourselves is, um, or accusing, I guess, humanity of supreme hubris. Should
Sure.
it, should we build there? And he concluded by basically saying, like, if we build a city here, does that mean that we're like, nature isn't allowed to have earthquakes, right? Like,
Yeah, so it's really kind of getting at this whole man versus nature thing, and what's our role, and even what's our fault, right? If we're living in places
mhm.
we shouldn't be living, perhaps.
Yeah. And I mean, and the thing is that we experience this, obviously, still today. And it's one of those things that we always, well, a natural event happens, some disaster happens, and there's inevitably these questions of like, well, why do people live there? I mean, every time there's a hurricane in
Sure.
Florida, right? And you see these photos of, things just washed completely away, and the question comes, well, why do we allow people to build in these areas, or whatnot? But it comes down even to smaller things. Like, for instance, here in Utah, I talk to so many people when they know that I'm a landscape, work in the field, and they're like, okay, hey, the deer come down and eat my plants, and I hate it, and yeah. And I'm like, well, you built the deer's habitat, so
Right, they were there
like,
first, right?
yeah, nature was here, and we're building in nature.
Sure.
And it is, but and especially as our technologies increased, we have definitely developed this hubris, right? This
Sure,
vanity
sure, sure.
that we can conquer nature. And then, of course, nature just comes along and says, I don't think so. And, increasingly shows the impacts of what it can do, what it can dole out. So,
Well, yeah, that's true. And something we've seen here in hurricane country, you'll get people say, "Oh, I've lived here 50 years. My neighborhood never floods," right? When you go
yeah,
back deeper in history, you see all kinds of catastrophic things that happen. But you're mentioning hubris, sometimes even people just feeling like, well, if I haven't seen it in my 40, 50, 60 years, it can't happen, right? And so this
right.
is where we get blindsided again and again by things that absolutely can happen. We just thought, hey, I haven't seen it in my 45
Mhm.
years, so it'll never happen, right? So we see a lot
Yeah,
of
we
people
get,
making dangerous decisions, thinking
uh-huh.
what they've seen in the past 45 years is everything that can happen, and that's really not true.
Sure, we get lulled into that false sense of security. Getting back to like that Turkey earthquake, they were talking that was like the biggest earthquake, and I can't remember what. I think it was back to like Roman times or something
Sure.
like that. But yet we knew this is a seismically
Yeah.
active
The time scales
area.
of certain disasters. I think about the Pacific Northwest. I mean, we haven't seen a big
Mhm.
tsunami come into Washington, Oregon, really in the modern era. But when you talk to geologists who've done some coring and they've looked at sediments, they've said, man, we see evidence, right, of massive
Yeah.
tsunamis. But the time scale, it's not even like a Florida hurricane that might come around every decade or two. These time scales are
Mhm.
huge, but again, at some point, nature comes knocking on the door and repeats maybe what it's done before
Yeah.
we knew about it, before our modern era. Um,
Yeah. It's true. So I mean, like, well, let me tell you how some of the design sort of changes that came out of this learning experience of
sure,
disaster then in Lisbon, because I think some of it is really interesting. So when they rebuilt, the first thing, obviously, was that they didn't want another earthquake to come and knock down
yeah,
everything again. And so they developed this innovative building or architectural design, where they constructed wooden cages with a square grid, and then with a diagonal grid laid over the top of that, to try and, control for the shaking, and so they built this flexible wooden frame, and then they put the facade around the frame. So in
Benjamin,
an
you're talking
earthquake,
about the construction of a home or a building post earthquake.
exactly. Yep. Yep. And so then if there was an earthquake, the facade might fall off, but the structure itself wouldn't collapse. And now, if that sounds familiar, it should, because that's, how most modern buildings are built today, with this inner frame, and then that artificial facade, right? And what's particularly noteworthy was that the Portuguese actually built miniature, in like scale models of these, and then they'd have their soldiers march around to mimic the movement of an earthquake, and they would look at the model and see, and they would make changes of their design. And so it's really interesting to see this emergence of engineering structures through modeling, where they set that up. They also then pioneered the introduction of fire breaks in the neighborhoods to prevent the spread of fire through the city. One thing that I thought was really interesting that I learned about was also, in order to speed up the process of rebuilding, they implemented standardization of building materials.
Oh,
And,
interesting. Okay.
I mean, it's another one of those things that we in the modern age, we just take for granted. You go down to Home Depot, and you can buy a 2x4 and an 8 and a 10 and a 12, whatever length and stuff.
Sure.
But it used to be everything was there was no standardization. And so the government introduced standardization, so you could design to a certain size and get all this material and stuff. And then, probably most noteworthy, though, was the redevelopment of the design of the actual fabric of the city. And so the Baixa, which was kind of the historic or urban core there, they redesigned it with these rectangular blocks, classical facades, wide streets. So no more like serpentine streets that, it was really almost a century ahead of its time. It would be mimicked by Haussmann's redevelopment of Paris, Lafont's design of Washington, D.C. And so it was really also an early precursor to what's known as the City Beautiful movement. And if you think of like the Chicago World's Fair, the architecture there and that whole time, that was the City Beautiful.
So Benjamin, this concept of like wider boulevards and things like that, you're saying some of that was inspired by development in Lisbon post 1755 earthquake.
Yeah, in this reconstruction and this pattern was one of these, these early urban models saying this is how, we might develop, that was then looked at and inspired future developments elsewhere.
It's so interesting. What you said about standardizing materials, we just take for granted that that's how we operate. And even a friend of mine used to do framing, and that's just so prolific way that we do building as well, right? We can go to a new subdivision, you see the frame go up, and then you see the materials around it. It sounds like a lot of influences came from really like planning and development in Lisbon post 1755 earthquake that we might not realize that they still influence us today.
Yeah, there was all these threads that kind of like have survived through and, were picked up elsewhere and reinforced elsewhere, et cetera, and stuff. And it was really interesting. And it also, I think, emphasized the need for strong central bureaucracy. So the person leading the effort, the Marquis of Pombal, he really basically dove into this and took a firm hand and said, okay, we're going to implement these policies, we're going to do these things, etc. One of the things that as well we saw was the use of eminent domain to confiscate a lot of property to redevelop. And eminent domain was used before so that, like nobles could build whatever they wanted. But this was one of the first uses where it was used to not benefit just a few wealthy elite, but to really redevelop
benefit the masses.
The masses. And so we see the application of that then still today. They renovated their sewer system, and it was really that was really important and set the standard for new sewer systems. So it really was. There was a lot of things for an event that, like I said, I think a lot of people are totally ignorant of. it had, there's things that have resonated throughout history, kind of
Well,
down
and
to us in the
Benjamin,
modern day.
something that stands out to me in this story is that no one ever would have wished that catastrophe to happen, just like any other catastrophe, but actually like good did come out of it. Right. And so we
Yeah.
see that sometimes you go into a hurricane zone or a tornado zone, and often a community says, hey, we're going to build back better. We're going to build back stronger. We're going to make changes. And those changes can really help mitigate and reduce losses and save lives in the future, even though the original event, no one would have ever wished it. Hey, Benjamin, we're almost out of time. I know our listeners are going to love to connect with you. Can you just share, Are there certain professional meetings you go to every year? Can people find you online? Like, how can our listeners connect with you and find you?
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, I have a terrible online presence. So one of the best ways is just really to kind of check my department website, which is laep.usu.edu. If you add a backslash vivid, that takes you to a research lab that I'm part of. But yeah, I'm at mostly academic conferences and things like that, but people can find my email and don't inundate my inbox with emails. But, if somebody's particularly interested or wants to connect, they're certainly welcome to reach out.
For sure. And I think this is a really interesting profession. It's very multidimensional. Hopefully our podcast influences maybe some students and young professionals who may have some questions for you or want to even come out to Utah State and study with you there. So Benjamin, thank you for coming on the podcast. I learned a lot from you today, and this was really interesting to do a deep dive on that 1755 Lisbon earthquake. I had no concept that influenced a lot of our building practices and around the world, including in the West, over several hundred years.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to come on and speak about it and everything else. So thanks so much.
Fantastic. It's been awesome. I've learned a lot. Can't wait to follow what you're doing in your career, and excited to meet your students here on the Gulf Coast tomorrow. So I'll tell them you said hello, and we'll have a good interaction. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Great. Thank you so much, Hal.
We've been meeting with Benjamin George, Associate Professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning at Utah State University. We had a fascinating conversation today about the field of landscape architecture, about environmental planning, kind of how those fields can really impact and improve our response to disasters, how we can mitigate against disaster losses. And we really did a deep dive there on the 1755 earthquake in Lisbon, Portugal, talked about how the earthquake itself, the tsunami, this massive wall of water that came ashore, and then the fires afterwards really inflicted catastrophic losses there in Portugal back in 1755. And then the influence of that event, how that shaped how we build and plan all over the world, including in the Western culture here several hundred years later. A really fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Benjamin. And we look forward to the next GeoTrek podcast when we'll be talking about a different topic. We're going to be covering a lot of different topics over the next couple weeks, getting into topics like emergency management, looking at this field trip that the Utah State University students are doing over spring break. And we're going to get into some discussions as well about the upcoming severe weather season in the Southern Plains, southeastern U.S., and other areas where we're going to see tornadoes, severe weather, hail, strong winds. It's that time of the year where we start thinking about severe weather in those parts of the country, and we'll have some content related to that as well. Everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. Stay weather aware, and we'll catch you on the next episode of the GeoTrek podcast.